They should have stayed in coach where they belong. The words sliced through the air like a cold razor, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, yet no one moved. No one turned their head. No one spoke. All eyes, as usual, found safety in silence. It was supposed to be a simple flight from Atlanta to New York, but for 11-year-old Leona Grace Williams, it would become a memory that would scar deeper than any turbulence. A lesson not from a textbook, but from the quiet cruelty of polished men in pressed suits. Leona sat quietly in seat 3A. Her tiny hands folded over her backpack like it was armor. Her Sunday dress was crisp and white, a reward from her mother Carolyn, a night shift nurse who had saved tips for months just to make this trip possible. For once, her little girl would sit in first class. For once, she'd see a world that didn't come with apologies or closed doors. But not everyone believed she deserved to be there. Seated beside her in 3B was Douglas Doug Whitford III, the kind of man who'd never had to check a price tag in his life. Mid-60s, 3 generations deep into real estate wealth, and the sort of smug that only comes from thinking the world owes you silence when you're being cruel. He had already made 3 complaints before takeoff. The air is too dry. The champagne is domestic. And his last with a pointed glance. Since when did children fly first class? Leona had tried to shrink into her seat, but the seat, like the world, didn't seem made for shrinking. Then came the moment. Serena Jackson, the flight's lead attendant, poised, observant, and quietly dignified, was distributing tea with care. As she leaned toward Doug, he stretched out accidentally on purpose and with one sudden motion tipped the entire cup of steaming tea straight into Leona's lap. A gasp escaped from Leona's lips, sharp and childlike. The tea scorched through her dress and burned her thighs. She didn't cry yet. Her body tensed, her hands trembled. But her dignity, that held strong. Doug didn't look apologetic. He looked amused. "Oops," he chuckled dryly. "Accidents happen. Though you really should dress more appropriately for first-class, sweetheart. That color shows everything." And that's when the cabin turned to stone. Not a single passenger uttered a word. Not the older man in 3C with a wedding band and Wall Street Journal, not the woman in 4A scrolling on her iPad, not the young couple in 2D who had nodded warmly to Leona earlier. They all saw, they all heard, but no one stood up, except one. Serena stood frozen for a breath, her face a portrait of professional calm, but in her eyes, fire. Fire held by reins. She slowly stepped forward, eyes flicking between the scalding tea spreading over Leona's white dress and the smug contempt curling on Doug's lips. "Sir," she said quietly but firmly, "I need to speak with you in the galley. Now." Doug blinked. "I'm sorry. Is there a problem?" "Yes," Serena replied, her voice cutting like steel wrapped in velvet. "And I suggest we address it before it lands." The hush in the cabin was suffocating. The tea still dripped from Leona's dress onto the carpeted floor like some kind of ritual humiliation. Her hands clenched her backpack tighter, not for comfort, but to keep from shaking. She looked up at Serena, and for the first time, someone looked back. "Let me ask you, watching this right now, what would you have done if you saw it? Would you have spoken up? Would you have defended that little girl? Or would you have looked away like everyone else? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever seen something unjust, something so wrong, so obvious, and yet the world around you chose silence? Because this wasn't about spilled tea. This was about spilled power, spilled entitlement, spilled cruelty masked in manners. And this was just the beginning. Doug had no idea that the girl he just humiliated came from a mother who'd faced worse and learned to fight back in quieter ways. He didn't know the flight attendant he just smirked at had once left teaching after watching a school system chew up kids like Leona and spit them out broken. And he definitely didn't know that the smartwatch on Leona's wrist was still recording every word. Because some stories don't unfold at 30,000 feet. They drop, hard, and the thud echoes across the country. What do you think happens next? Who will speak up when the plane lands and who will pretend nothing happened? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for the rest of this unbelievable story. Because silence may feel safe, but sometimes silence is the crime. The hum of the engines filled the silence Doug left behind as he followed Serena down the aisle, trailing entitlement like cheap cologne. Seat 3A sat empty now, except for Leona, small and shaken, her lap soaked through the white fabric of her dress, now stained an amber brown. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack again. A tear finally welled in her eye, but she blinked it back fast and proud. No one said a word, not even the ones who looked sorry. But let's be clear. Silence speaks, and in this cabin it spoke volumes. Across the aisle in 3C, an older gentleman in a tailored blazer adjusted his glasses. He had seen it all. You could tell by the way he lowered his eyes, embarrassed not for Leona, but for himself. A woman in 4A looked out the window, suddenly captivated by clouds. The couple in 2D exchanged glances, but said nothing, just like Doug knew they wouldn't. Because Doug wasn't just rich, he was connected. The kind of man who shook hands with city council members and smiled in front-page real estate listings. He knew that money not only bought land, it bought deference. And too often deference is mistaken for dignity. But he hadn't expected Serena. Back in the galley, she stood eye-level with him, chin slightly raised. "You just humiliated a child," she said flatly, folding her arms. Doug smirked, leaning slightly as if to assert control. "I spilled tea. It happens. Besides, little girls don't belong in first class." She looked out of place. "We both know it." And there it was. Not whispered, not disguised, said like a man who's always gotten away with saying whatever he pleases. Serena stared at him for a long second, not blinking, not flinching. Then she turned, pulled out her phone, and typed a notation into the incident log. "This isn't over, Doug." Warned voice lower now. "I know people." Serena didn't answer, but in her silence there was thunder. Meanwhile, back in 3A, Leona reached into her backpack with trembling hands and pulled out her mother's scarf. Soft lavender. She laid it gently over her lap. The tea had already burned her thighs, but it was the shame that stung worse. And still, no one around her moved. But let's pause here for a second, because if you're watching this and you're thinking, "I would have said something," then ask yourself, when was the last time you actually did? Because every one of those people in that cabin thought the same thing. They all felt bad. But feeling bad doesn't protect children. Speaking up does. And now, let's talk about Carolyn Leona's mother. She was still at home folding laundry after an exhausting 12-hour shift at the senior care center. She had sacrificed everything for this trip. When Leona had won her school's Rising Voices essay contest, the organization offered 2 options: a check or an upgrade to first class. Carolyn didn't even hesitate. She said, "Let my baby see the world from up there just once." She'd taken a photo of Leona that morning standing proudly in her white dress at the gate. Carolyn didn't know. Couldn't know that just an hour later that same dress would be stained and her daughter humiliated. But someone else knew. Leona's smartwatch had been recording the entire encounter, and across the country a series of auto-sync uploads had just begun pushing that footage to the family's shared cloud. Leona may not have realized it, but her pain wasn't alone. Her story was already leaving the confines of that silent cabin, already beginning to fly faster than the plane itself. Back in the front of the aircraft, Doug returned to his seat. Serena didn't walk behind him. She stayed back, staring at the wall of the galley for a moment, breathing deeply. She had worked 22 years in the airline industry. She'd dealt with drunks, divas, even celebrities. But never had she seen such calculated cruelty directed at a child. And so many adults choosing quiet complicity. She returned to 3A. Kneeling beside Leona, she whispered, "Sweetheart, I'm sorry. You did nothing wrong." Leona looked at her, blinking hard. "I know," she said. Quiet, strong. It wasn't the tea. It wasn't the dress. It wasn't even the burn. It was the knowing. That deep, aching knowing that even when you're quiet, even when you behave, some people will still decide you don't belong. Some truths don't scream, they simmer, and sometimes the quietest child on the plane is the one holding the loudest evidence. When Serena whispered, "You did nothing wrong," and Leona answered with that soft but unshakable, "I know," something shifted in the air, not for everyone on board, but for Serena. Because for the first time in years, she saw herself again not as just an airline employee, not as a uniform with a badge number, but as a witness. And witnesses have choices. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and turned toward the cockpit. But before taking another step, she glanced at Leona's wrist where the small pink smartwatch blinked faintly. It wasn't just telling time. It was recording. Back home in Savannah, Carolyn Williams had just put a load of whites in the dryer. The apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms. A tiny kitchen, linoleum floors worn from years of careful steps. Her body ached from overnight shifts, but it was her heart that carried the weight. She'd kept her phone close all morning, checking for texts from Leona. Not because she worried Leona was always so responsible, but because she was a mother, and that's what mothers do. Then the notification popped up: new video uploaded from Leona's watch, Flight 327. Carolyn clicked without thinking. Back in the cabin seat, 3A had gone silent again. Leona hadn't moved much. Her scarf still covered the stained dress. Her eyes scanned the aisle like a chess player calculating the next move. Only 11 years old, but already learning what it means to survive when you were never meant to be invited. And while adults pretended nothing happened, the truth had begun its quiet migration from her wrist to the cloud, and from the cloud to her mother's kitchen. Carolyn's face changed as the video played. The screen was tiny, but the emotions were big. Doug's voice, the tea splash, the smirk, the line, she should stick to Coach, and the way no one said anything. Not a sound, not a defense, just the hum of the plane and the sting of indifference. Carolyn stood frozen, phone shaking in her hands. Then, slowly, deliberately, she pressed share. Back on the flight, Serena had entered the cockpit. "Captain," she said, voice steady, "we have a situation." She described what happened. The captain nodded slowly, his lips pressed in a firm line. "Passengers witnessing?" he asked. "Too many," Serena answered, but only one stood up. The captain didn't say much after that, but he did radio the gate. When the plane landed, he said they'd need someone from security, quietly, discreetly, but definitely. Meanwhile, at 32,000 feet, a storm was brewing on the ground. Carolyn's post began to spread. She didn't tag names. She didn't add hashtags. She didn't scream. She just wrote, "My 11-year-old daughter was scalded and humiliated in first class today because she didn't look the part." She recorded it. "I want you to hear what some still say when they think power protects them." Within 20 minutes, a parenting group picked it up. Then, a local civil rights organization. Then a journalist from Atlanta who remembered Carolyn from a healthcare worker spotlight during COVID. And then, the video hit 10,000 views. Then 50,000. Then 100,000. The cabin crew didn't know yet. Doug certainly didn't know. He sat there, sipping his second whiskey, humming a Sinatra tune, confident that the seat next to him would stay empty, just like his conscience. But in seat 3A, Leona slowly opened her backpack again. She pulled out a worn notebook with a single page folded at the front. It was her prize-winning essay, "Where I Belong." She had written it weeks ago for school, about how belonging isn't about money or titles, but presence, respect, and being seen. She had no idea her words would one day match her scars. "Let me ask you something. If that smartwatch hadn't recorded, would anyone believe her? If Serena hadn't stood up, would anyone care? If her mother hadn't shared the truth, would anyone listen?" Comment below. Have you ever carried a truth that no one wanted to hear until it was too late? How many times do people have to be hurt before silence stops being the safe choice? Because what's coming next? It's not just a confrontation, it's a reckoning. Tell him not to touch my daughter again, or I swear this plane won't be the only thing landing today." The gate agent froze. She had never seen that look before, not in 20 years. Not from a woman in scrubs holding nothing but a phone and a mother's fury. Carolyn Williams had arrived. Hours earlier, she had kissed her daughter goodbye with a laugh and a prayer. Now she stood in Terminal D of JFK, her jaw clenched so tight she could barely speak. The video had gone viral in less than 3 hours. It wasn't just a clip, it was a detonator. A white man, a black girl, a hot drink, a stained white dress, and silence. That silence now screamed across every news outlet, Twitter feed, and group chat from Brooklyn to Birmingham. Back on Flight 327, the captain had been informed. Serena stood tall in the galley, clipboard in hand, the pages vibrating slightly in her grip. She wasn't just logging an incident, she was loading a cannon. She didn't know that her quiet report had sparked something far louder on the ground. That the clip was already being reviewed by 3 civil rights lawyers, a state senator's aide, and a retired judge who'd once sentenced Carolyn's own father for speaking out in the 60s. Funny how history loops. Doug still sat in 3B, smug, calm, unaware. Unaware that the woman he'd dismissed as one of those nurse types was now on the ground waiting, armed with evidence fire and a name no PR firm could whitewash. Unaware that the hashtag white dress flight was now trending #1 in the country. Unaware that his company's stock had dropped 4.7% in a single hour. Unaware that in just moments the gate doors would open and he would step into a courtroom without walls. Leona, meanwhile, stared out the window. She clutched her essay in one hand, the smartwatch in the other. She didn't understand trending hashtags, but she understood pain. And the difference between being seen and being stared at. Serena crouched down again beside her. "Do you want to be the one to walk out first?" she asked softly. Leona blinked, thought, then nodded. As the wheels touched the tarmac, the cabin filled with that familiar buzz. Seatbelts clicked, bags shifted, people stood. But not Doug. He stayed seated, arms crossed. He knew something was wrong, now he just didn't know how wrong. The jet bridge extended. The doors hissed, and standing there flanked by 2 uniformed TSA agents and a woman in scrubs who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days, was Carolyn. Eyes like steel, posture like granite, voice like thunder in a church. "My name is Carolyn Williams. I am the mother of Leona, Grace Williams, and I'm here to collect my daughter. Not your apology." The agent beside her leaned in. "We've been advised to escort the passenger in 3B to questioning." Quietly. Doug's face paled for the first time. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "It was T. I barely touched her. I didn't even—" But no one was listening anymore. The world wasn't listening to him. It was listening to the voice of a black mother who had had enough. Outside the terminal, reporters gathered like vultures circling a carcass, but this time the prey wasn't Leona. This time the cameras turned toward the man with too many houses and not enough shame. Let's pause here. Not for drama. For truth. Because how many times have we seen this play out differently? How many videos never get posted? How many girls never record? How many mothers never make it in time? Have you ever watched someone be hurt in public and no one did anything? Comment below. Tell us what silence costs. Because this time silence didn't win. As Carolyn wrapped her arms around her daughter, the white dress still bore its stain, but the girl wearing it. She stood taller now, because this time the world didn't look away, and the man who thought he could humiliate her, he just became a footnote in her story and a headline in his own downfall. The door slid open with a hiss, and for a moment no one moved. The silence wasn't peace. It was tension holding its breath. Doug stood in the threshold of the jet bridge like a man stepping into gunfire, except this time the bullets were truth and the wounds were all self-inflicted. His face twitched with the kind of forced humility that only shows up when power feels threatened. Behind him, Leona walked with quiet steps, her small hand clutched inside Carolyn's firm grip. Her dress still bore the stain, but somehow it looked like a badge now, not of shame, but of survival. They hadn't made it 10 steps into the terminal before the first flashbulb went off. Then another. And another. Reporters barked questions like attack dogs. "Sir, is it true you told the child she didn't belong, Miss Williams? How is your daughter holding up Leona? What would you like to say to the world right now?" Doug raised his hand, shielding his face like the spotlight wasn't deserved. But the world had already decided otherwise. And then, in the middle of all that noise, a voice cut through. "She speaks when she's ready, not when you're watching." Carolyn didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice carried the weight of every woman who ever held back tears while holding a job, a child, and a fire in her belly that the world kept trying to extinguish. A hush followed. Then, slowly, Leona stepped forward. No podium, no microphone. Just her barely 5 feet tall glasses slipping down her nose, holding that crumpled essay in her hand like it was armor forged from every book she'd ever read. "I wrote this before the flight," she said quietly, almost to herself. "My teacher told us to write about where we belong." Cameras stopped clicking. You could hear the terminal breathing. "I thought I belonged in the air," she continued. "Because when you're up there, no one knows how much money you have. They don't see the color of your skin. Just clouds, just sky." She looked at Doug. "But I was wrong. Some people still look down even when they're sitting up high." The stillness shattered. Applause rippled through the terminal like thunder chasing lightning. Not the kind of applause you give out of politeness. No, this was raw, emotional, the kind that makes your palms sting and your throat tighten. Doug tried to speak, but his voice cracked under the weight of what he'd done. His PR rep, now sweating beside him, whispered something in his ear, but no script could fix what had already been lived. And then came the real twist. Leona turned not to Doug, but to the passengers who had watched it all unfold in silence. "You saw," she said, eyes sweeping the crowd. "You heard, but you didn't say anything. I forgive you, but I hope next time you don't stay quiet." It wasn't anger, it was disappointment wrapped in grace. And that stings worse. A woman near the back began to cry quietly at first, then openly. She was in seat 4A. She hadn't spoken on the plane. But now she couldn't look away. Across the country, screens lit up. Clips of Leona's speech flooded timelines, newsfeeds, inboxes. Her name trended for 48 hours. Civil rights organizations called. School boards pledged diversity training. Airline executives scheduled emergency ethics meetings. But none of that compared to what happened next. Doug Whitford III resigned. Not because he wanted to, because his investors told him to, because his board voted 9-1, because America finally said, "Not this time," and yet none of it was enough to erase what had been done. Leona still had scars on her thighs where the tea burned through. Carolyn still woke in the middle of the night replaying that video. Serena, back in uniform, kept a copy of Leona's essay in her locker. Because some moments aren't chapters, they're turning points. Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer from your gut. Have you ever seen a child stand taller than a man who thought he owned the sky? Comment below. Share the moment when silence ended and courage took its place. And if you haven't had that moment yet, maybe it starts here. Because this wasn't just a story about tea or class or a stain on a white dress. It was about a girl who took everything meant to shame her and turned it into truth. And the truth, it never stays quiet for long. There's something strange about power. It always believes it will survive the spotlight, until the wrong person steps into it. It had been 4 days since Leona's quiet words echoed through the terminal like thunder in a chapel. Since Doug Whitford III resigned. Since every media outlet from The Atlantic to Fox and Friends dissected that flight like a forensic team at a crime scene. America was talking, but now someone unexpected was ready to speak. Her name was Charlotte Whitford, Doug's wife. They called it a private statement, But nothing is private when you've been married to a man like Doug for 30 years and finally decide to tear down the curtain from inside the house. She wasn't flashy. No makeup, no prepped speech, just a pale blue cardigan, a silver cross around her neck, and a folder. A thick one. "I never intended to speak publicly," she began, her voice tight but steady. "But I've seen what silence costs. I lived with it. I enabled it. And I watched a child pay the price." Her hands shook slightly as she placed the folder on the table. Inside were emails, receipts, and something far more damning, testimonies. Turns out Leona wasn't the first. Doug had a pattern. Not loud, not violent, but surgical. Quiet hostility. Remarks no one dared correct. Donations made to keep stories buried. Payoffs to hotel staff. Complaints that vanished in exchange for bonuses. He didn't scream slurs, he smiled while denying promotions. He didn't push, he pulled rank. And over the years, Charlotte watched, stayed, prayed, justified, until a child in a white dress broke what 30 years of excuses could not. Back in Savannah, Carolyn watched the press conference from her couch, Leona curled against her side. The burn marks on her thighs were healing, but some wounds take longer. When Charlotte said, "I didn't speak for the maids, or the interns, or the drivers, but I will speak now for the girl on that flight." Carolyn's chest tightened. So did Leona's grip. This wasn't justice, but it was something. And in a world where something is too often nothing, that meant everything. The fallout rolled in fast. Doug's company, already hemorrhaging, was hit with 4 new lawsuits in 72 hours. 2 former employees filed affidavits. One airline union announced a nationwide training campaign funded by public donations in Leona's name. Even the airline changed its policy. Passengers witnessing discriminatory behavior are encouraged and empowered to report without fear of retaliation. It shouldn't have taken a child being burned for this to happen, but it did. And now, every passenger on every plane in America knew exactly who to thank. But the twist. It wasn't just Charlotte's statement. It was what she hand-delivered the next day to Serena Jackson. A letter. Personal. Handwritten. No lawyers. No cameras. "Miss Jackson," it began. "You stood when others sat. You saw my husband for who he truly is. I didn't. I'm sorry it took so long. Enclosed is a donation in Leona's name to establish a scholarship for girls like her so they never have to beg for a seat that was already theirs. Enclosed was a certified check for $250,000. Serena didn't cry, but she stared at that letter for a long time before slipping it into her locker beside Leona's essay. Because she knew something most people didn't. True power isn't about seats or titles. It's about standing. Even alone, especially then. And still, Doug didn't apologize. His lawyers blamed misinterpretation. His friends whispered witch hunt. His statement read, "I regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred." But no one believed him anymore. Even his silence felt expensive. And in the week that followed, the cost came due. It started with the board of directors. They'd stood by him before through gentrification lawsuits, labor complaints, whispers of racial bias in hiring. But this time was different. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a child's voice, soft, clear, broadcasted across 9.7 million screens. A voice that wasn't bitter or angry, just tired of being ignored. And that made Doug's silence louder than any confession. By Wednesday morning, 3 board members resigned. By Thursday, 3 investors went public, stating that Doug's behavior, and worse, his refusal to acknowledge it, had damaged the brand beyond recovery. By Friday, his own daughter Melanie Whitford issued a statement on Instagram. "I love my father, but I no longer recognize the man he's become or the silence he hides behind." To Leona, you didn't just change the narrative. You exposed the rot underneath it. Doug's empire began to crack. He was uninvited from charity galas he once chaired. University buildings named in his honor had their signage quietly removed. Talk shows stopped referring to him as community philanthropist and started calling him the man who spilled tea, then drowned in it. Even his country club revoked his membership. Not out of principle, but optics. Because when power becomes poison, even privilege scrambles to rinse its hands. And yet, Leona never asked for any of this. She wasn't watching the news. She wasn't reading headlines. She was at home with her mother planting sunflowers in styrofoam cups for a school project. "They grow fast," she said softly, "but only if you water them every day." Carolyn smiled, brushing dirt off her daughter's hands. "Kinda like truth, huh?" Leona nodded and smiled just a little. Then came the call. The city wanted Leona to speak at the Savannah Civic Unity Forum, a gathering of educators, policymakers, and youth leaders from across the state. They offered her a speechwriter. Carolyn declined on her behalf. She already knows what to say. You all just need to listen. The night of the event, the hall was packed. Not with celebrities, but janitors, nurses, students, retired veterans. A minister from South Carolina brought his whole congregation. A group of Delta flight attendants sat together wearing small white dress pins in solidarity. And in the third row sat Charlotte Whitford Doug's estranged wife, holding hands with a black woman she used to work alongside but never spoke to until last week. Leona took the stage in a navy blue dress. No stains, no fear. She looked older than 11 because America had made her grow faster than any child should. "I didn't ask to be known," she began. "I just asked to be safe and seen." She paused. "On that flight, someone thought I didn't belong because of what I wore and what I looked like. But it wasn't just him. It was everyone who stayed quiet. That silence burned more than the tea did. You could feel the room clench like a breath no one realized they'd been holding. But I'm not mad anymore. I'm just hoping that the next time you see someone like me, you won't wait for them to speak first." She stepped back. The applause started small, then grew, then thundered. People rose, some wept, some held their children tighter. Because in that moment it wasn't just Leona being seen, it was every child ever told they didn't fit. That night Carolyn tucked her daughter in gently. "Do you think he watched?" Leona whispered. Carolyn paused. "I hope he did. But it doesn't matter, because tonight wasn't about him." Leona smiled. "It was about finishing the story, huh?" Carolyn kissed her forehead. "No baby. It was about rewriting it. Some people think silence protects them. But when enough people stand up, silence becomes its own confession." Leona didn't demand revenge. She didn't scream. She simply told the truth and made the world decide what kind of place it wanted to be. So now, we ask you, what will you do the next time you see someone being told they don't belong? Because the dress still fit. The problem was never her. It was the mirror the world refused to look into. Too often we teach our children how to behave but forget to teach ourselves how to speak. Leona didn't fight with fists. She didn't beg for justice. She stood with quiet truth. And in doing so, she held up a mirror that many of us didn't want to see. The truth is, the world doesn't just fail because of the people who do wrong. It fails when the people who know better say nothing. It fails when a child needs proof to be believed. It fails when silence is treated as professionalism and not cowardice. So the next time you see someone being humiliated, dismissed, or denied their dignity, don't wait for a camera. Don't wait for the news. Say something. Stand up. Speak. Because the world does not change when victims raise their voices. It changes when the rest of us finally choose to listen. If this story meant something to you, take a moment. Like the video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Leave a comment and tell us when you found your voice or when silence cost you too much. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. Because we don't just tell stories here, we tell the truth behind them. Thank you for watching. Not just for your time, but for choosing to stay when the world so often looks away.